So I am going to turn it over to Sid, and then I'm going to sit down and enjoy the conversation myself. Sid?
All right, how's everybody doing? So, first things first, Rick Bragg and Roy Wood Jr., congrats on being named Alabama Humanities Fellows. Can we just give them one more round of applause, please?
Thank you.
And congrats to all the honorees tonight. You know, this is an award that's gone to some pretty remarkable people. Harper Lee, Brian Stevenson, recently, earlier this year, Brittany Howard and Jason Isbell. And I don't know if y'all saw that one, but they actually got up and performed at the end of their conversation. So
that was nice.
Y'all are welcome to step up when we're done here.
I mean, when we're done, I'm just going to pull the fire alarm again and get out of here.
I thought it was you.
I don't have any jokes.
I want to start out just asking you about this award and what it means to you. Rick, I'll start with you.
Well, I saw my friend Wayne Flint in the lobby earlier, and you know, I just wanted to pass away before Wayne so he could do my funeral. And but with all due respect to Roy, I think they just kind of worked down to us. I mean, you know, it's kind of like when someone passes you the popcorn in the movie theater and all that's left is seeds and grease. Yeah. So, I'm sorry. No, I am. You reach a point in your life where these things mean a whole lot more to you. And these are, I mean, just think of what it took to put this thing on. So they're good people in a good organization. It means a lot to me. And I'm honored to get to do it.
Roy, I know you've got family here tonight. Your mom's here. You grew up here in Birmingham. What does this mean to you?
It's humbling. You know, I've never really done anything, I mean, here at the crib in the spirit of an award or a trophy or anything like that. It was always I don't know, I always operated from one core belief that I cannot assume that anybody else will care about Alabama who's not from Alabama, so it's kind of on me to try and do something for Alabama. And I deal with, you know, a lot of times, a lot of guilt with leaving the state, you know, in the sense of there's so many more people who live here that are doing so much work and so many different things, and you have to be boots on the ground. And when I came back in 2018, I think, to shoot a Comedy Central pilot, and the amount of legwork that already had to be in motion for my show to have a chance to be shot here was on the backs of so many other people that had already been laying railroad track in the fog, not even knowing what the next thing would be in terms of an opportunity. So, you know, I'm thankful to be on a list with so many other people that have had an opportunity to leave the state but continue to pour back into the state. Some of those names on that list are homers who never left. But to leave and be able to be recognized is a dope feeling. On top of that, there's so many people in here that I haven't seen in years. Like, I'm like the fire alarm was like a mini class reunion for me. I got here late. I didn't make the reception. I'm gonna be in the lobby after the show because there's so many more people I didn't get a chance to just say hello to. I mean, Bruce Ayers is here, the owner of the Comedy Club Stardome, and that is literally the first place I ever attempted a syllable of organized thought on a stage was in Hoover behind that Best Buy. Well, it was a circuit city back then, but you know, but you know what I mean. It's so to see old classmates. I mean, my friend Trey McClure is here. I've known Trey since the 6th grade when I rode the bus out to Christian. Like, that's to be, it's one thing to be honored, but to have people who know what your life was before this to be able to come and celebrate you it's humbling. I'm gonna try not to cry, but you know, it means a lot.
You know, I know you've got a new comedy special coming up, and I think the mayor would agree with me here. We'd love to have you come back and do one in Birmingham one of these days.
I have plans to shoot a special in Birmingham. What I've tried to do, when it is time, I want to do something that helps to tell the story not just of me, but of the city as well, and tie myself. It should mean a little more than just DC, give it up for like that. You could do that, and that's fine, but it needs to be something that could have only been shot in Birmingham. And I'm writing a book. I sold a book, and so it's a semi-memoir of the lessons that I learned from the various men that came in and out of my life after my father passed. And so where my sense of values and morality came from was just a hodgepodge of people, and a lot of them were here in the state of Alabama. So maybe it's a one-man show hybrid of those stories, and you bring that to life, but you tell that story within the confines of this city. I think it could be a beautiful thing. But you know, I definitely struggle with the idea of coming home, because let's just be real about Birmingham. When they see you too much, they may not pay to come see you. This is a conversation Bruce Ayers and I have had many a day, but
I found that not to be true.
But you know, you're 12 years on 95.7, and then after that, you're another 10 years of philanthropy in and out of the city. Whenever, you know, I'm fine with figuring out the right thing that fits. You know, I wish I could sing like Ruben Studdard and give you a Christmas concert every year. I don't have the notes, but I am anxious to get home.
You know, talking about home, I'd love to talk about that for a second. Both y'all grew up in Alabama, but you grew up in two very different parts of the state. Rick, you grew up in Jacksonville, near Jacksonville, Calhoun County, which was really about as rural as it gets. And you know, Roy, you grew up in Birmingham's West End, though I know you moved around quite a bit as a kid. And
yeah, it was all West Side, though. It was West End, little Avenue I action in there as well. Fairfield for a quick minute, but yeah.
I'm wondering if y'all can talk about the specific house that you grew up in. What did it look like? What did it feel like? What did it look like when you're driving up the driveway?
Well, some of you will know what this means. You've heard the phrase Jim Walter House. Is that right? You know, you could buy from Jim Walter Company a shell, a 2-room shell, and I think it was a couple $100. So it was, you know, me and my mom and both brothers and my grandma in this place. But that, look, I'm not one of those people that is going to say, oh, but it gave me character. I mean, yeah, I've done enough to get what little bit of character I have. But there were things like, you know, everybody couldn't have a bed. And I would sleep at the foot of my grandma's bed, which would be, you know, not very exciting, except she had dementia. She had it bad, and she had walk-in dementia, which meant for 25 years she had it. And she showered me with $1 bills and fried chicken. And at night, every night, she would tune her AM radio to a station far off. back then you could get, St. Louis, you would reach down.
Yeah, on a clear night, yeah.
Yeah, and of course Nashville. So I'd go to sleep with Hank Williams or Sam Cooke, and so, it was awful poverty. And people say, I bet you wouldn't trade anything for those days. I say, hell yes, I would. My mom, if she had, I'd trade it all so that my mom would have had an easy life. That don't make me a good person. It's sensible. But, I grew up between cotton fields and I grew up with swamp. And, I grew up throwing rocks and fist fighting. And my first jobs in that little house were, I ran a chainsaw. So, look, all this seems pretty easy now.
Yeah.
All this seems pretty easy now. Maybe that way with you.
Roy, what about you?
Well, can I ask Rick a side question? Sure. Do you ever go back to that old house or drive back down that street or look back down that neighborhood?
Probably once a week. I lived everywhere from New York to L.A. to spent some bad months in Port-au-Prince. But I've lived all, from Miami to Boston. But, when my people kind of got sick in old age, I came home. And, that's my job is, I need to write some every now and then, but because I found that you eat much better if you continue to write. But that's a good question. Yeah, I go by that little house a lot. And my uncle, a guy named Ed Fair, one of the things that I did for him was a fork rock. And I would had this big steel-tined yard fork. And it's awful work. And when I quit him at 16, he gave it to me. And he said, hang it on the wall. And you'll never think you got any bad luck at all.
You still have it?
God, no.
Yeah, so I grew up West End. We moved to Birmingham. I was in the third grade, mid-'80s, maybe like 85, 86. And it was the rise of crack and the beginning of white flight kind of overlapping in the same way. So we kind of had like the last few white neighbors you might have had on the west side in the 80s. Our house was my mother, my father. My pops worked in the morning at Wynn, so he was off doing morning news. And then my pops would come home, sleep during the day, and then he would be off at night to do his jazz show on Wynn and AGG or whatever. My mom worked a traditional 8-hour shift, and then somewhere there was law school or there was grad school. There was always something night. So I was kind of a latchkey kid growing up. I was able to keep to my own devices. We lived in West End near the intersection of South Park and Pearson Avenue, about 3 minutes from West End High School at the time. I was zoned for Price. My mama lied and got me over to Central Park. Yes, you did. You lied. You lied because you wanted me in a gifted program that they only offered at Central Park. And so for educational, they can't take the degree from me now, Mama. What they gonna do? I'm 45. Like they can't. You didn't graduate elementary school. So it was a 2.5-mile walk. It was a 45-minute walk every day from school to home. And you cut through the South Park projects. So the first thing you had to deal with was gangs that was roughing you up for your money. Sometimes they wait for you to go in the store. They take your candy. You get through the gangs, then you've got another mile to survive the whatever rabbit, random dog. Anybody on the west side knows there was always a dog. And you got these thick-ass Houghton Mifflin textbooks And sometimes you would just lose your textbooks and take off and have to circle back later to get your trapper keeper off the side of the road. I'm old enough to remember when they first built the 5 Points West Library at the original location across from the McDonald's at Bessemer Superhighway. They offered computer classes there. So now instead of cutting past the projects, I had to go through the projects every day after school to learn how to use an Apple computer, to become computer literate until my mother could afford a computer, which eventually happened. You know, if you could make it home, you were good. My pops made sure there was encyclopedias, there was books to read. I had a Nintendo. I didn't have all the games, but I had a Nintendo. But once you were home, that was it. You couldn't really go anywhere else. The neighborhood was starting, the degradation of the neighborhood was starting. And what I really feel like saved me growing up is my mother bought me a basketball goal. So we would ride our bikes down Pearson to Powderly Park. It was Powderly Park at the time. It's got a different name now. But we would go down to Powderly Park, and you could play basketball there. But if you play basketball there and they get to shooting, well, then now you're in the middle of some crossfire, straight bullet situation. And so my mother saw fit, well, if I get the goal, if I get a basketball goal, he's not going to have a reason to really go out in the neighborhood, and you're grabbing candy on the way home. So there's no other errands to run as a 5th, 6th grader. And I started hooping in our yard. The other advantage we had a tall 2-story house. It was one of the few 2-story houses in the neighborhood. The people my father bought it from added a second deck, added a second story to the house with these tall, 25, 30-foot acorn trees. And we also were the only house in most of West End at that time that had a 2-car garage. So a 2-car garage meant you could play off the dirt and you could damn near play half court. And the trees gave you shade. So in July, our driveway was 10 degrees cooler than Powderly Park.
So you had a popular basketball court.
Which meant every terrible person on the west side came to our house to shoot hoops. But out of respect to my mom, who was a Birmingham city educator at the time, and out of respect to what my father had built, even if the kids didn't know me, their parents knew my father. Out of respect, no bullshit ever went down at South Park Road. They would leave guns up the street. They would leave liquor up the street. And they would come and they would shoot hoops until 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, to the point where my mom had to start putting a lock on the rim so that she could study for law class. And they would come over before I got home from school and knock politely on the door, "Dr. Wood, is it okay if we shoot hoops?" So by 6th grade, from Central Park Elementary School all the way to the Piggly Wiggly on Tuscaloosa Avenue and Bernie Points, I was good. Because if you bother me, you know you can't come shoot hoops. And it really changed the dynamic of how I was able to move through a very dangerous, our house was fine. We lived 2 doors over from a documented drug dealing house. But our house was fine. And I was able to move through that neighborhood because basketball was the gift. Between that and the Central Alabama Boys Club, where I met the younger brothers of everybody else who was causing trouble in the neighborhood, it ingratiated me into the community as an out-of-towner. And that gift, that remains to this day, playing baseball in Little League at Central Park. And the beauty of the Boys Club is that you meet everybody in the city, because not everybody goes to a boys club that's on that side of town. And you couple that with going to Christian for a little while, going to Center Street for middle school in Titusville, and then you go to Ramsey, and everybody from every side of town converges on Ramsey. So by the time I got back and I was on 95.7 and going out and doing hits, I knew everybody in the city. And I think a lot of that came back to basketball. You know, home was just a place to do homework, take a shower before you go back outside and play.
Rick, I'll come back to you in a second. But I want to ask you about your radio career. By the way, how many of y'all heard Roy on the radio back in the day?
A few.
So, and your father, Roy Wood Sr., was a well-known broadcaster, and I mean, he had an extraordinary career. He covered the civil rights movement. He covered Vietnam. He won all kinds of awards. He passed away when you were in high school, I believe, but I'm wondering what he would make of your career now. I mean, there was no Daily Show when he was in radio. What would he have thought?
My father was not a very funny man. She know, like it wasn't, and I think a lot of that's just a byproduct of what he'd seen, man. You know, he was in South Africa getting shot at during race riots, and for whatever he saw while covering in Vietnam, he never talked about that. Never discussed it. The only time I ever saw my father laugh was when he would be at Pete Stone's Style Shop on 4th and 16th, which was where a lot of the black intelligentsia and the black collective seemed to convene, you know, at the time, mayors and the Earl Hillier. People would just come through. Larry Langford, when he was still in Fairfield, being a mayor, like just would just come through and converge. He would laugh then. I was in 7th grade, and we were at Center Street, and our soccer team needed jerseys, and we had a dunking booth at a bake sale, and my father was supposed to come and pick me up after school, and I was taking too long, and he hops out the car and snakes his way through the bake sale to see me in the dunking booth, and he was livid. He was livid, and I don't remember his exact words, but it was essentially to the equation of, don't be a fool for fools. And I'm like, we just want some jerseys, bro. But he saw humor that was self-deprecating and he wasn't a fan of that. I think that early on, I don't know how much of my comedy he would have rocked with. You know, if you look at my stand-up, I started when I was 19, so your worldview is limited. From age 19 to maybe 28, it was pop culture jokes. It was jokes about roommates and your gas light come on, and why won't the gas light stay? Why the gas light always come on when a girl get in the car? And I wasn't talking about police reform into my early 30s, and I think maybe then, but I think in the sense of having a degree in broadcast and being able to be my own man, I think there we would have found some semblance of, simpatico, if you will. But early comedy, I don't know if my pops would have been calling his friends over going, listen to this, you got to hear this. But as I got older, I got angrier. And then once I had a child, I think we'd have been smooth sailing. I go back and I listen to a lot of my father's old recordings, his old speaking engagements and reel-to-reels and stuff. And I'm talking about the same stuff. It's just a couple of punchlines in between it. So I really think in that regard, we're the same.
You go back and listen to those recordings?
Yeah. When the machine works, it's reel-to-reel, so it's very antiquated. But yeah, I try to go back and listen to some of that stuff and put together some of the pieces of who he was and how he saw the world, so I can better identify that for myself, so I can pass that to my child. But I think he would be proud, but I think it would have been some years before he would have been a fan. But he also came up in a time where there was no, political satire wasn't a thing in the 80s and 70s and the 80s. It was all buttoned up Larry King. So, that was as much as lighthearted as political conversations got, was Larry King. Yeah. And look where we are today. I'm on CNN cussing.
I want to talk some more about journalism in a minute. Rick, no one has been more central to your work than your mother, Margaret Bragg. You've written countless stories about her. You've written books about her. What did she think of your decision to become a journalist?
Thank you, Miss Woods. There's not a great deal of I don't want to say respect, but there's a big gap between the mill workers, and you can say farmers, but you know, if you own land and you were a farmer, you were an upper class Southerner. But you know, if you worked in a sweatshop and had to worry about the needles going through your nails, those were my people. And many of my, you know, the generation above me, and many in my generation didn't read. So a newspaper was, you know, they just couldn't figure out why in the world I was making $150 a week, driving a dump truck and running a chainsaw and, you know, lifting things. And I quit that when I was 18 to go to work for the Jacksonville, Alabama News for $50 a week. And no one could understand it. Nobody could understand. And I just tell them the truth that nobody in the history of journalism had ever, and look, I worked in places where I got shot at. I covered some terrible places. But no one in the history of journalism ever had their brains knocked out by a swinging pine limb while they were searching for a metaphor. So my mother did not, you know, it was a long time. I know they were proud of me. I found out many years later that my aunts would collect all my stories and cut them out of the papers, and they would put them in a file. And I didn't know any of that, though. You know, and when I left home, first to go down to come to Birmingham, which was, you know, the dark side of the moon. It was just a different, you know, you only went to Birmingham if you were dying, you know. And I think my kidney doctor is here. Don't take that personally. But when I moved far away to L.A. and New York, I know they were proud of me, but there was a little bit of a disconnect. There. You got to be careful talking this way, because somebody will say you're a snob. That's not true. There was just a disconnect. And it only was connected back with the books. You know, the books were about them, about their struggle, about their joys and pain, and now, you know, nobody, when I was writing about the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, I went home, nobody said, "Hey man, I really love that story about Kashmir." You know, boy, them people go at each other, don't they? And when I tell this story about the difference, is they're proud of you, but they don't. Maybe it's like your dad. They're proud of you, but there's not a lot of giggling that goes on. And I got a Neiman Fellowship to Harvard. You might not know by looking at me, but I am a Harvard man. And but I got this thing, and I came home to spend a little time with my mom before I went up there to freeze to death. And there's a tradition among blue-collar guys in my part of the Deep South. It always amazes me when you see them in movies. They're they're running their mouth and they're posturing. The kind of Southern men who run a saw or string barbed wire, they don't do that. They're very quiet. And the tradition is, if someone sees your truck parked in a yard, they will pull in to not talk to you. And there might be 10 pickups in the yard, and the guys, the drunks would have a six-pack of beer. Excuse me, the non-Presbyterians would have a six-pack of beer. And they would stand with their elbows on the bed of the truck in a U and not talk. They would look at dogs, they would look at tools, they would look at each other. And I remember right before I left to go up there, my cousin Tommy Big Chicken Green, you can't make that up. We called him Big Chicken because he was timid, but he was 6'5". But he spoke less than anybody. And my brother Sam all of a sudden just said, Ricky's going to Harvard. And there's a long silence. And about 10 minutes later, Tommy Big Chicken Green said, "Well, that's good, ain't it?" And so, they forgave me for leaving home when I did the books. But they didn't like me leaving home.
I think part of it is that you're doing something that you're jumping into a construct that isn't the norm or hasn't been seen. So people trying to quantify it in a linear fashion is very difficult for people to sometimes understand. And then you also cannot explain it back in a linear fashion. Yeah, I got a degree, but I think I'm going to just keep doing comedy. I have 2 job offers, the Tampa Tribune for $12K, the Birmingham News for $14,100. I've done the math on my existing road work. I should make $17K. If 95.7 gives me the rights to my prank phone calls, I can make a CD, and I can sell that CD at these $17K worth of shows and probably make another $10K. That's $27K. If I can get Music and More to co-sign it, and then Sam Goody in Century Plaza, and if I can get the other Sam Goody in the Galleria to carry it, I can probably sell it. But you're trying to explain that to someone who's just get the degree, and then the job comes, and then you have the job, and then you retire. And I don't know how to explain it because I don't even know what I'm doing. All I know is that I enjoy it, and I've figured out a way to make a couple dollars at it.
See, that's not a problem for me because I'm still a freshman at Jacksonville State University. It's true.
So there are lots of reasons not to go into journalism. And I could give you 100 of them, but Roy, I wanted to ask you about someone that you mentioned at the end of your first Comedy Central special called Father Figure. I think it was your first one.
Yeah.
And you dedicated the film to Dr. James Hawkins, who was a journalism professor at Florida A&M. And I'm just wondering if you could just share what your connection was to him and why you dedicated that to him.
Well, let's start. Number one, he introduced my parents to each other. Like, not even messing around. Like, that man is the reason that I exist. Which was the first thing he reminded me of at freshman orientation. But, Dr. Hawkins was one of those professors who just gave a damn a little bit more than he had to for the students who needed a faculty member to care just a little bit more. When I got to school, the interesting thing about Ramsey, and like I would go to Camp Birmingham, and the boys go, like, you're just around pretty decent people the whole time. And so the influence to do well is inherent within the peer circle that your parents have constructed for you. And I got to college, and I didn't have that same structure. I was only one of 4 people from the state of Alabama at Florida A&M. So I knew no one. So you hit reset on the friendship button, and you create a new social circle, and you end up arrested for stealing credit cards. And then, yeah, I blame it on the other people. And so that got me suspended for a semester from school. And so the depression that comes with that is where I found stand-up comedy. But then it's still that you need to get this degree. You still need to figure out what you're going to do. And so Dr. Hawkins was one of those people. When I got back in school, he made sure, and I don't mean this in some sort of, preachy, lean on me, Principal Joe Clark kind of way, but just he had a way of giving you a look in the hall where you would just go study. Like certain teachers could just get, should you really be out here, or should you be in one of them rooms doing journalism? And I was dean's list the rest of the way when I got back in college. I was doing stand-up. My grades were pretty solid, and I worked 20 hours a week at Golden Corral. That was my life. And I ran into certain hurdles, like when you're suspended from school and they reinstate you back into school, there's certain restrictions that you're not allowed to do anymore. I could not pledge a fraternity. I could not play intramural sports. I could not go to the library unless it was study group. I could not go to the pep rally or the basketball game. I couldn't, there's so many things, and there was a gray area where I needed an internship to graduate. And this internship, more often than not, comes from a local TV station. You go work at some local TV station and you get your credits, hip hip hooray. But if you're on probation, who's gonna touch you? Who's gonna trust you? Even if you have the strength of the university behind you, there are far better candidates. And keep in mind, in Tallahassee, there was only 3 channels. This wasn't Atlanta where you have cable and all of these plethora of production companies to go work for. It's 3 network channels, and you're competing with all the kids at Florida State. And the scheduling of working on campus and doing campus radio or campus newspaper, it just didn't work because I was still trying to do stand-up. And I went and talked to Dr. Hawkins about it, and this is what I mean, where, he was never the type of professor that would give you the answer, but he would simply ask you, have you thoroughly exhausted every solution? And he essentially said, I said, all of these intern programs, none of them are going to take me. I've applied to all of them, and these people don't want me. Nobody likes me. And I just, he goes, those are all the existing programs, right? I go, yes, sir. He goes, well, seems like some of these places that don't have an internship program need to create one. Seems that maybe somebody should encourage them to create an internship program. Light bulb goes off, and there was a morning show that I listened to every morning. The mid to late 90s was the rise of hip-hop radio, all rap stations. And Tallahassee was finally having that separation where it wasn't one station that played every genre of black music. This station is a dedicated genre. And we had a hip-hop station, WVHT Hot 105.7, and I rode my bike to the station one morning, and I waited outside at 5:30 in the morning, and I waited for the guy, Van Wilson, and I said, hey, man, I'm a student in J School over at Florida A&M. I listen to your show every morning. I noticed that you don't have anyone doing radio news on the 10s and the 40s. Would you mind if I come in every morning at 6 a.m. and do the news? And he said yes. And that was my internship that I created for myself. And it just so happens that that internship blossomed into something more because the morning show had a co-host who was a school teacher. He was also a comedian named William Gilmore. and William Gilmore had to leave the show every morning at 8. It was a two-man show. So from 8 to 10, it's just me and Van, and I'm the news guy. But from 8 to 10, after a couple of months, I became the co-host. And I co-hosted. And those air check tapes from that year and a half at Hot 105.7, that ended up being the air checks that I was able to use that got me hired at 95.7 Jams. And those things, one thing leads on top of the next. And so, you know, the biggest lesson that I learned from Dr. Hawkins is that no matter what corner you think you're painted into, you just have to take a minute and you have to think about what hasn't been done. And then from there, start building a solution instead of always looking through the lens of this is the only path. And if this path is closed off, there is no way. So that's like that conversation with him essentially started a 15-year career in terrestrial radio. So that's the kind of person he was. And, you know, I'm very grateful to him.
Well, we need more Dr. Hawkinses, and we need more journalists. We need more storytellers, as we've been talking about tonight. Rick, you've been a professor at the University of Alabama for, what, 20 years now?
Until they raise their standards.
So I know for a fact that you've inspired a lot of young writers because I've met and I've employed
Hired
some
some of them, yeah.
of them.
That's on you.
I'm wondering, how do you teach someone to be a successful storyteller these days? What are you talking to them about? What are you telling them?
Well, first you have to be honest about the realities they're going to face when they walk out that door. So I don't teach straight news or investigative reporting or anything. I teach what I do. I think we call it narrative nonfiction, but it's really just magazine writing. And I do a lot of that still. And I think it's pretty simple. And I always get in trouble because you want to see a writer get mad at you. Tell them, hey, it's really pretty simple. And but to me, it always has been. You paint a picture and you hang it on the air. You paint you look at the big story, the bigger story, and you look in it, and you do that by talking and gathering string and or just sometimes knowing things. And you find that scene that illustrates the larger idea. When I did Shoutin', all over with Shoutin', I didn't have any of the struggles that most journalists face. I got a call from the best literary agent in New York. I was working in New York, and she said, I don't know who you are, where you're from, but I'll represent you if you want to write a book. The next day, I get a call from an editor at Knopf, actually Pantheon of Random House, and if you want to write a book, we'll publish it. So I didn't have those struggles because I did all my blue-collar work in newspapers, getting to that point. And but I believe in that book. I could have bored people to death in the first page of that book. I could have been preachy, and I could have shook my fist at our poverty. And my daddy was a Marine in Korea. He killed a communist soldier by holding his head underwater. So I could have, and then he came home, lost himself in a bottle. So I could have preached, but that's not the way you tell a story, and this is what I tell the students. You find the scene. And to me, it was redbirds, cardinals. So if you watch them any length of time, they are a beautiful and bizarre creature. So the first page was, I used to stand amazed and watch the redbirds fight. they would flash and flutter like burning rags through a sky unbelievably blue. And on the ground, they were a blur of feathers stabbing for each other's eyes. I would see grown men stop what they were doing, lift their head out from under the hood of a broken down truck, or stop picking corn and just watch it. And once I watched one of those birds peck itself to death in the side mirror of a truck, hurling itself against that unyielding image until the glass was cracked and smeared with blood. And I asked an old man who worked for Uncle Ed, named Charlie Bivens. I said, "Charlie, why do you reckon that bird did that?" And he told me it was just its nature. And that's my daddy. And, and that simple thing has worked from the time I was, covering high school football at Jacksonville, Alabama, to now. Not everybody necessarily agreed with it. Stephen King pretty much tore me a new one on my Jerry Lee Lewis book, and Pat Conroy called me up and said, Stephen King telling you that you can't write is like, what's her name that's dating the Kansas City chief?
Taylor Swift.
Yeah. It's like her telling Patsy Cline that she can't sing. And he's a good friend. I've had a few better. When one of my mentors was a guy named Willie Morris. He was a great Mississippi writer. He was the editor at Harper's, probably the first kind of modern magazine editor. And he died. And I was talking to Conroy on the phone, and he said, "Did you go to the funeral?" And I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Where'd they have him laid out?" And I said, he lies in state at the Capitol Rotunda in Jackson, Mississippi. And Pat was quiet, and believe me, he was rarely quiet. He said, the state of Mississippi knows how to treat a writer. The state of South Carolina will throw my body in a Dixie dumpster. And the state of Alabama will drag yours behind a Buick. So my point is, not everybody agrees with my methods, but I really believe just paint them a damn picture and make the facts clear, which I, have had trouble with, but nobody has ever accused me of underwriting.
Well, speaking of Patsy Cline, I think it's time for y'all to sing. Y'all please give it up for Rick Bragg and Roy Wood Jr. It's been an honor to be here. Congratulations to all the nominees, all the winners.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Yep.
Thank you, young man.